OSM is a collaborative modeling platform. So the software was developed by Forest Research, but a lot of the underlying models were actually developed by a collaborative group of people. The ingrowth and regeneration modeling was down at the University of Maine, and a lot of the growth survival relationships were from ERD. So that's really a collaborative open source effort. And we're trying to improve those ingrowth relationships now through Marie-Andre and her team. We've also found in the PSPs that some of the ingrowth has been underestimated through work by Walter Emmerich. So there is something going on there, and we're just working towards fixing that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a project which I think is really a precursor to a lot of regeneration modeling and even silviculture and climate change work that we're involved with. And the title of this talk is Mapping Tree Species Ecological Affinity in New Brunswick. I'll try to get into that a little bit. This project was really led by NHRI. And we use software for Forest Research and a lot of in-kind data support and time through ERD on this, and technical support and review of some of the predictions by Heidi Earle at Northern Hardwood Research Institute. And I'd say the earliest work of this kind may be from Vince Zelazny's team in developing the ecological land classification system for New Brunswick. His team put together from ground data surveys where species, where they are abundant across New Brunswick, but they didn't really map it. They mapped it spatially, but it was by map sheet. So not necessarily mapping sugar maple's affinity to nice, good sites in upland topographical positions. So we can see kind of northern and southern affinity, but we can't really see where sugar maple or black spruce would naturally occur and compete well across our topography. So the purpose of this project was to kind of extend this work and produce maps at high resolution, locally and topographically, where species are likely to compete well and have naturally occurred. And it's underscored in some of the discussions in Chapter 6 and Appendix 2 by Vince Zelazny on the importance of this, from site productivity, forest succession modeling, management planning, and even impacts of climate change, understanding species migration, and so on. So, and it's getting more and more difficult to apply ecological land classification, at least with respect to species, at least overstory tree species, because we've really changed the landscape quite a bit. We've got plantations now where tolerant hardwood used to be, and you know, we're terraforming to a certain extent this landscape, it's somewhat difficult to tell whether or not sugar maple would naturally grow on some of these sites. So what if we could rewind the last, say, 100 years worth of management and map out where we would expect sugar maple, black spruce, and some of these other site affinity, with high site affinity, these species with high site affinity would naturally occur on the landscape. So what if we erase the last 100 years worth of disturbance? And that's kind of the effort that this presentation is going to talk about modeling that. Where would sugar maple be, and what abundance would we expect in these different topographical positions? So our objective is to predict the ecological relative abundance or affinity of tree species in New Brunswick as a function of location and topography from a very large amount of ground surveys and photo-interpreted stands since the 1980s. And the reasons we want to do this are many, but one is to consider natural species affinity for silviculture planning. some of the plantations that we established. We really deal a lot with competition control on some of these sites, especially for sugar maple. It's very difficult to control that competition. You kind of want to know what you're getting into before you put that plantation in. Gaytown was interested in understanding if there were certain sites that had an affinity for beech versus sugar maple, and maybe sites that maybe would be better for uneven age management or maybe an irregular shelterwood management to control that beech. I think that there's real value here in terms of modeling forest succession in our strategic planning models. I think that there's value in ecological land classification and site productivity prediction. You know where black spruce is or sugar maple is, you get a really good indication of site. And from my past productivity modeling work, I found that knowing where species occur is often better than knowing anything about soils, bedrock, with respect to our current layers of soil and bedrock and depth of water table. They're just not accurate enough. If you look at the species that are on the site, it tells you a lot. The other thing that has come up as of late is climate change, and through a project I'm involved with down at UNB, and NHRI is also involved in this project, we're looking at trying to understand how species might migrate and what the barriers of that species migration might be from other species. So we think that this might also have benefits there. So we're lucky in New Brunswick in the sense that we have a very rich history of photo interpretation. We completely photo interpret the forest back in the 1980s. We did it again in the 90s, and we did it again this century. So we're still doing it. So we can roll back at least the past 40 years worth of management, and that provides us with a great deal of sites that are relatively undisturbed. We're not talking about trying to roll back to the 1700s and getting back to real natural species compositions, but if we can roll back 100 years, and really it's the past 40 years that management has really intensified, I think we can get a sense of where these species would likely occur across these different topographical positions. This is an area I'm going to come back to. We're going to show some of the species mapping for this. So just kind of keep it in your head. It's between St. Quentin and Edmundston in the Uplands area. So we have that photo interp, but we also have a lot of ground surveys that have been conducted over the past 30 years that I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. Some of our FDS, Forest Development Surveys. So we'll bring those to bear on this project as well. So the objective here was to try to map species at a very local scale. So you think of Vince Lasney's maps showing relative abundance on each map sheet. What we're looking at is mapping relative abundance to a 20-meter cell, almost like the precision of LiDAR. To do this, we need a lot of samples. So we started with every photo-interpreted stand as kind of an observation, and there's 1 million of those. So we had 1 million observations of stand composition to start with. If we roll back, if we look at some of the mature old stands to start with in our current interp, we get the composition from those, give us a sense of what would naturally occur on the landscape. And then for the remaining that have been clear-cut or planted or PCT'd or turned into agriculture or even urban, we look back to the 1990s and 1980s and tried to fill in the blanks on what used to be there. And for the remaining that we still didn't have information on that had been harvested pre-1980, we tried to impute those and predict those. We looked at kind of down the valley and looked at where sites hadn't been disturbed and tried to predict, given this lowland area, high depth of water table, low slope. You can see down here that it's black spruce, so likely it's black spruce here. So we tried to fill in the holes using a nearest neighbor matching algorithm. And then we got to work of taking those observations and putting them to work. So at every single one of those stand locations, we built a regression model. And we tried to predict species abundance as a function of slope, depth of water table, and elevation in a very constrained area, like a 2-kilometer moving window area. And that resulted in about 1 million regression models for each species. And then we predicted out on the landscape on 20-meter cells using those models. About 20 of those models, as we moved across the landscape, we take the average prediction from those models. And that resulted in about 175 million predictions for each species. So it's amazing what you can do with computers now, but this really allowed us to map at very high, I guess, local precision species affinity to sites. And this is really important because if you go to the lowlands and you see low depth of water table and low slope, it can mean something completely different in terms of species compared to an upland site with those same attributes. And so having this local context in the modeling is important. There's a problem though. We're basing a lot of this information on the 1980s photo interp, which can be biased. And the other issue in the 1980s photo interp is that a lot of the species were grouped. We're trying to get at sugar maple, but all we have is tolerant hardwood. We're trying to get at black spruce, but all we have is spruce. So there's a bit of a resolution issue there. So the solution we came up with was to leverage that ground inventory, which does have individual species and no bias from the photo interpreter. But the problem with using that information is that it's not as dense as what we had with the photo interpreter. We've got 30,000 plots out there, but we need a lot more than that to map the resolution at that fine scale. So what we did is we combined those two. What we did is we first predicted the, I guess, affinity of tolerant hardwood sites using the photo interp, and introduced that into a variable as a variable in the model in addition to the topographical variables. So we had the kind of upland conifer, lowland conifer, cedar, white pine, intolerant hardwood, tolerant hardwood, kind of these broader species groups, predicted out onto the landscape, and we introduced those into a new model that tried to predict the local species affinity or relative abundance that was observed in these 30,000 stand surveys observations. So same approach. This time we built 30,000 models, and again ran those models out to 175 million predictions across the landscape for each species. I'm a little bit more comfortable in that approach in that I trust the ground information a little bit more than I do the photo interpreted information, especially back in the 1980s. Today's interp is actually not bad. So this is what that model looks like. And I think, is that the same slide? Yeah. Okay, so in terms of accuracy of the model, there's a bit of detail here, and maybe just listen to what I have to say about it. What was interesting was that species that would naturally, you think of as having strong ecosite affinity, like sugar maple, like black spruce, came up to the top in terms of accuracy. So species that have this strong ecosite affinity were predicted very well, with an R-squared of about 50%. As you go down the list into generalists, like red maple, or species that kind of occur across a lot of sites and kind of do well on a lot of sites and are intermixed on the landscape, like white pine, the accuracy went down a bit. You can see in that top right graph, we're seeing very good agreement. On the x-axis, we have predicted relative abundance of sugar maple in 5% classes. And then we have on the y-axis the observed in the FDS. So that's the training data, that's the timber cruisers. And as a validation, we took an independent data set, our current sample plots, and we compared predicted versus observed again, and we came to similar conclusions about accuracy. For some of the species down here and here, the accuracy dropped a little bit, but sugar maple, black spruce, and some of these other species held up quite nicely. So getting back to this image, it's in the uplands area kind of between Edmundston and St. Quentin. I just want to show you some of the results of the mapping. So kind of try to envision or make a mental note of these streams and what they look like, and then you'll see how that plays out. I mean, we can see some of the tolerant hardwood ridges and the conifer and the lowlands. But, you know, what would we expect down in this area here? This area here. I'll just flip through some of these. So this would be shade-tolerant quality hardwood, quality being sugar maple or yellow birch, not beech. And green is a lot, almost 100%, and red is very little. And you know, at very high resolution, this is 1 to 50,000, we're able to map out the likely affinity of shade-tolerant hardwood to these sites. Same area, just breaking down into sugar maple on the far right top, upland conifer on the bottom left, and shade-intolerant, mid-tolerant hardwoods, so red maple, white birch. And we can see the affinity of, as we move north, we're getting into more intolerant hardwoods for whatever reason. And as we go down into the valleys, we're getting into more fir and spruce. Not so much black spruce in this site, mostly fir. As we move east, over into the highlands, this is an area close to Popple Depot, Mount Carlton area. You can see the Nisquit River running through here. And we're up a little higher, we're 1 to 200,000 here. And you can see balsam fir, affinity of balsam fir on some of the more higher elevation sites. Jack pine down here, probably maybe a remnants of some burning, some larger fires down there, I don't know. Yellow birch and sugar maple, and I was checking out the rock types around here, and certainly we're getting into more granite on the right, and we're getting into more calcareous, finer sedimentary on the left. So, I mean, it's lining up with what we would expect in terms of where these species would occur with respect to fertility. And we've got black spruce on the far left, again, showing that composition. Some final points. I think that this is a big step toward mapping local species affinity topography. In terms of resolution, I think it's kind of a quantum leap. I think it's relatively accurate, at least in terms of some of the species that have high site affinity, like sugar maple and black spruce. And I think it's interesting because we kind of let the species speak for themselves, rather than relying on trying to map species to kind of poor soil maps and poor geology maps and climate maps that we're just not super comfortable with using those as is. And this was made possible by localizing these models, so using that moving modeling window and allowing the relationship between species and abundance and topographical position to evolve over the landscape. Depth of water in the lowlands is very different than the depth of water in the uplands. terms of what you can interpret from those values. So I hope these maps will be useful to you. We've posted them on the Forest Research website, so forestresearch.com/speciesaffinity.php. And you can go down and download the GeoTIFF files and have a look. There's also this presentation up there and some more information about the methods and accuracy of these maps. In terms of future work, I'd like to maybe integrate some of Shane Furtz's new soil maps, new soil attribute maps, some of the new LiDAR slope, elevation, and possibly depth of water table if it comes to fruition over the next year or so. And then Charles Bork's topographically based soil water availability and drought maps. So if we can get those into the model, I think we can make some real refinements here. Perhaps try a more aggressive filtering strategy, removing any stands with any clear-cut history, changing the algorithm around, maybe using regression trees instead of linear models. And it would be nice to, instead of producing individual species maps, to actually map out forest type affinity. So maybe prorating these percentages, because all the maps are developed independently. They don't necessarily add up to 100%. Some species are missing. So it'd be nice to try to consolidate that somehow into a forest type mapping of affinity. Just like to thank Gaetan for kind of getting this project off the ground, and Heidi for helping out technically. Funding came from the NRCan Climate Adaptation Platform down at UNB in the Northern Hardwood Research Institute, and again, data providers and in-kind support from the Department of Energy and Resource Development, Forest Watershed Research Center, UNB, and the University of Brunswick. So thanks.
Validation first. Why was cedar so unique in terms of what the models predicted, like on the models? Learn from that, or that you wanted to?
Why was the validation so low?
Yeah, 12% compared to your 40%.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm predicting that. It may just be that some of these species that are currently in parts of our landscape are a little bit more difficult to predict. We've only had 2,900 plots. And the other thing to keep in mind with those accuracy statistics is that the accuracy, what we're trying to predict there and evaluate in terms of accuracy is it's the accuracy of these models in predicting the composition of sugar maple in that stand. And that's not really what we're trying to do here. What we're trying to do is evaluate the composition of sugar maple across a topographical position in a local area, right? So a more refined, probably next step here would be to identify an accuracy measure that will reflect that. And I think the models would be quite a bit stronger if we